Hello everybody and welcome back to another exciting edition of Chromatographic, the show in which I, Matt, the Game Boy, take you through the highs and lows of the Game Boy Color library, one card at a time. This week we'll be continuing with MayForward, with Xtreme Sports. With Mickey's Ultimate Challenge successfully shipped, WayForward began to look for its next project. Voldi had moved in with Matt Bozon and Rob Buchanan halfway through the game's development in order to get it shipped. But what would happen afterwards would change their lives. Voldi had since allowed WizardWorks to distribute the fun pack for Windows, eventually selling 500,000 copies, a staggering amount compared to the 3,500 units he'd sold himself at swap meets. However, while looking for avenues to sell the fun pack himself, Voldi had looked into having the game stocked in grocery stores by a local rack jobber, who eventually turned him down. What the rack jobber did provide Voldi with, however, was an idea. By leaving him with a few copies of American Education Publishing's Brighter Child series, the rack jobber had unintentionally led WayForward towards educational software. Voldi took the Brighter Child books, scanned them into his computer, and using Visual Basic, made interactive versions of the workbooks. What had started for Voldi as an excuse to learn Visual Basic turned into a pretty competent product that he then sent to American Education Publishing, who fell in love with them. Voldi created 12 of these interactive books for the company before AEP offered to buy WayForward in 1995. Happy with the success of their interactive offers, American Education Publishing decided to form Brighter Child Interactive to go full steam ahead into the CD-ROM market. Voldi contributed all of WayForward's equipment and ownership of their software for a 20% stake in the new venture. Now as BCI, Voldi, Matt and Rob began to produce dozens of interactive workbooks for the company as the educational CD-ROM aisles in American stores exploded. The WayForward story might have easily ended here, with the team continuing to produce educational software for AEP forever, or again when AEP decided to exit the market and close Brighter Child Interactive. History has usually taught us that acquired studios are either absorbed into the company at large, or, on their closure, their talent is left scattered to the wind. But in what can now be seen as a mixed blessing, the closure of BCI meant WayForward returned to making the kind of games they're known for today. But that's not to say that the closure didn't come at great cost. While Voldi was able to buy back the equipment he contributed to Brighter Child Interactive, WayForward lost all rights to the software they developed before and while at BCI. Their team had now grown to 6 people, including producer John Beck. The team needed to get software out the door quickly, meaning, just like in the Mickey's Ultimate Challenge days, it was time to get hustling. Voldi, in an extra effort to keep the company together, began to bank payroll from his own credit card overdraft, while the team set off in search of freelance work to stay afloat. Their feet wet from their CD-ROM publication days meant the team was able to get work creating licensed PC and web games, as well as creating their own titles like a new 3D fun pack for Windows, and games like Xtreme Sports Arcade Summer Edition. Xtreme Sports Arcade was released in 1999 and featured 5 minigames: rock climbing, inline skating, skateboarding, skyboarding, and street luge, all of which are selectable from a menu. While Matt Bozon helped with some of the game's characters and their animation, he had his thoughts fixed firmly on the Nintendo Game Boy. Looking to create a game that may or may not have been about a half genie, Bozon reached out to Nintendo to see if there was still life in the black and white wonder. Due to what Bozon claims was an interest in the system at a time when perhaps nobody else had any, Nintendo offered to set WayForward up with dev kits, not for the original Game Boy, but for the Game Boy Color. Bozon claims that getting started with development for the Game Boy Color was incredibly challenging work, as their newly acquired dev kits were in Japanese. However, after several weeks of trial and error, the WayForward team began to make something for Nintendo's newest handheld on an engine created by Jimmy Huey. That game was called Xtreme Sports. Taking the sports from the original Xtreme Sports Arcade as a starting point, dropping climbing and adding surfing later into the game's development, the team originally started to make a game similar to its predecessor, that only gave players access to each minigame from a menu that would ship as the game's practice mode. However, determined to give players value for money, Bozon set out to develop a Pokemon-inspired overworld filled with over 200 challenges and 400 medals to claim from defeating them. Suffice to say, gamers got their value, as Xtreme Sports is an incredibly long game. The premise behind it is a simple one. After seeing a commercial for an Xtreme Sports competition on TV, Finn and Guppy, the game's playable characters, devise a plan to enter the contest and double their chances of winning the prize money put up by the Xtreme Cola Corporation. After selecting Finn or Guppy, the player is taken to the island and shown how each of the game's 5 core minigames work. Surfing is a straightforward auto-scrolling game in which the player must avoid obstacles while collecting stars and performing tricks for points. Skateboarding sees the player hammering the A button to skate through the course, performing jumps and tricks with the B button. Inline is a very similar concept, where you mainly score points from grinds and by ducking under point gates. Street Luge sees a player tapping B to propel themselves along a vertically scrolling track, in which they need to go through the point gates and avoid obstacles. While Skyboarding sees the player falling vertically, all the while gathering arrow keys to chain combos together while holding the B button. All of these minigames also contain a twitchy shake power-up that, with the press of the A button, will make you invulnerable and speedy for a short time. For my money, Skyboarding really is the most unique concept of all the sports featured in the game, and probably the easiest of them to master. Yes, dear viewer, I said master, because if you've got any hope of beating Xtreme Sports, besides the patience and will to persevere, you're going to have to not only master how each of these 5 minigames work, but each individual course, yes, all 20 of them, in order to beat the game. Why? Well, let me explain. Scattered around the island are Xtreme Sports enthusiasts who you have to beat in order to obtain their medal. Each course has a variety of opponents for you to take on in order to collect medals, all of which have their own unique challenges based on 3 overall criteria. There's time, which is obviously how fast you finish a course. Tricks, which is essentially score earned by, you guessed it, pulling off tricks and collecting points scattered around the stages. And a flag count. These red flags are hidden around each course and usually require you to play it through several times to figure out their location as well. They're not always obviously located. Sometimes your opponent has all 3 goals for you to beat, meaning you need to keep track of time, points and flags collected in order to win their medals. And when I say keep track, I mean it. Getting the flags without beating the time or score doesn't matter. You need to beat all of the stated criteria to win or you get nothing. Yep. Even if the challenge is just collecting 4 flags within a set time limit and you manage to score crazy high on tricks, if it wasn't part of the challenge, it doesn't matter. You need to start all over again. It seems like a lot to take in, right? Well, to be honest, it kind of is. In an attempt to create a Pokemon-esque adventure, WayForward made an incredibly large game world in what was originally planned as a minigame collection. With a few less challenges and much fairer point system, Xtreme Sports' need for medals could have been a lot more fun than it ended up being. Don't get me wrong, marathoning through the game like I did was never how it was intended to be played, but even so, I got fatigued with the game even though I was enjoying it. And honestly, I really did enjoy the game for the most part. While I immediately fell in love with the skyboarding and surfing, it took me a little while to get used to the other 3 events, and I only did so because I was forced to play them in order to progress. I know most of you are thinking that this sounds horrible, but honestly it wasn't. By restricting my access to different areas of the game, and with that access, the ability to play more difficult versions of the minigames I enjoyed, I really got good at and learned to appreciate the sports I was turned off with at the beginning. Just like a Mega Man game, I got a huge kick out of bashing my head up against a skateboard challenge and beating it with a second to spare. Brutal Sports may have been a more suitable name for this game, but I know the idea of this trial by fire will have sparked a curiosity in the gaming sadists among you. Beyond the trials and the minigames, you wander around the island, finding hidden medals and talking to NPCs until you've got enough to progress beyond one of the game's several gatekeeping umpires, who will block your access to more difficult courses until you have the stated amount of medals. The dialogue you have with these NPCs is very much the kind of things you'd find in early Pokemon games, but because of just how many NPCs there are to interact with, some of the things said are funnier than others. It's this light spattering of humour, combined with a half-decent soundtrack and gorgeous visuals, that will get you through Xtreme Sports, should you choose to pick it up. Yes, there is a bikini island shaped like boobs, and yes, the Goons Team Rocket shtick gets old very fast, but some of the things said by the NPCs won't fail to bring a smile to your face. Graphically, the game very rarely tears up or slows down, despite chunky sprite work and the speed of the minigames. The game's UI, the courses themselves, and each of the character portraits absolutely oozes the WayForward style now expected from the studio's original work. There are also one or two sneaky little references hidden in the background, so I highly recommend taking the time to slow down once in a while, as, like life, this game moves pretty fast and you might miss them. By entering the game's debug mode, you can also find a scrapbook the developers created to show off some of the game's concept art that I highly recommend you look at also because it's pretty fascinating. As for the game's music, well, perhaps not as memorable as that found in other WayForward releases, it is still pretty nice. Each minigame's theme works on one motif that gets tweaked for each course variation to great effect. Honestly, while I wouldn't listen to the music outside of the game, the fact I've heard it looped over literally for dozens of hours and it doesn't trigger the urge to throw the controller is not something to be overlooked. Overall, Xtreme Sports is a mixed bag that could have stood toe-to-toe with everything else WayForward put out on the system. Instead, the game ends up feeling like it's rolled a little bit too thin. While I enjoyed my time with the game, I have no urge to go back to it, which is a massive shame, as the minigames within it are incredibly well made and enjoyable. I've just repeated the same challenge way too many times for me to feel anything but disdain towards them. Please, if you do pick up a cart or get the game on the 3DS eShop, take your time and enjoy it as the developers intended. The cart comes complete with a battery save, meaning you don't have to try and beat the thing in one sitting. For those of you not bothered with the game's story, I highly recommended seeking the game out and just playing its practice mode. While it'll only keep you entertained for a few hours, it's probably the best way to enjoy all the things Xtreme Sports has to offer. And that brings us to the end of another Chromatographic and this second installment of MayForward, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've enjoyed. It has been an incredibly long one, but we will be back next week with another exciting chapter in WayForward's development. Until then, Game Boys and Girls, a huge thank you to all at WayForward for their support, and to you for watching. Game on.